September 30th, 2025, 10:14 in the morning. Inside Marine Corps Base Quantico, Virginia, an auditorium is filled wall to wall with nearly 800 of the highest-ranking military minds in the country. Generals, admirals, the people who shape how America fights its wars. Rows of crisp dress uniforms line the room as the air conditioning strains against the heavy Potomac humidity. The atmosphere isn't casual. It's tense, intent. At the front of the room stands the President of the United States. And he's not delivering a speech about logistics, funding, or force readiness. He's talking about metal. This is something we're genuinely looking at, he says, leaning closer to the microphone. The idea of a battleship. Thick 6-inch sides. Real steel, not aluminum. For years, the U.S. Navy has built its future around speed, stealth, and electronics. Ships engineered to detect threats first rather than absorb a hit. Floating networks of sensors and software, designed with technology in mind more than raw toughness. But what the President is suggesting is a sharp reversal. A deliberate step back toward armor, toward brute strength. I see those ships, he goes on, invoking the legendary Iowa-class behemoths of World War II. Destroyers running escort beside them. And nothing could stand in their way. To someone watching from their living room, it might sound like nostalgia. A throwback fantasy of smoke, steel, and the glory days of black and white war footage. But beyond that room, and thousands of miles away, in the Pacific, this isn't being heard as idle talk. Inside the planning halls of the Chinese Navy, it lands as something else entirely, a challenge. A signal that the United States might be ready to upend its current naval doctrine. Because if an order ever comes down forcing the Navy to walk away from lightly built destroyers and toward massive, 20,000-ton steel warships, the ripple effects would be enormous. Shipyards would have to retool. Battle doctrine would be rewritten. Budgets would explode. Even the character of a future Pacific war would change. And the real question wouldn't just be whether America could bring these ships back, but whether they could actually endure modern combat once they did. To understand why this idea carries so much weight, you have to look at the material at the center of the argument. One word the President keeps circling back to: aluminum. For roughly 4 decades, navies around the world have relied on aluminum alloys in the upper sections of their ships. The logic was simple. Less weight means higher speed, better fuel efficiency, and more room for advanced systems. It's what allows destroyers like the Arleigh Burke class to mount massive radar arrays without becoming unstable or dangerously top-heavy in heavy seas. But aluminum carries a scar in naval history. On November 22, 1975, in the Mediterranean, the cruiser USS Belknap collided with the aircraft carrier USS John F. Kennedy. Fire tore through the ship, and the aluminum superstructure didn't just burn. It softened, failed, and collapsed, sagging into a molten wreck. 7 sailors died. The cruiser was effectively destroyed. That haunting image, a warship turning into something like a burning candle, still lingers in the Navy's collective memory. It's the reason the steel versus aluminum debate never truly died. And it's the fear the President is quietly calling back to, that in a missile-heavy modern war, America's sleek, sensor-packed ships may be powerful, but fragile, lethal at range, yet unable to absorb damage. The so-called Golden Fleet idea circulating in Washington isn't simply about resurrecting old legends like the USS New Jersey or the USS Wisconsin. It's about whether the Navy has gone too far in trading armor for technology and what that gamble could cost in the next major war. Those old battleships are relics. 8 decades old, worn-out engines, spare parts pulled from museums. That's not what's being discussed here. The idea on the table is something entirely different. A battleship built for the 21st century. Imagine a hull displacing around 20,000 tons, roughly twice the mass of today's destroyers. This ship wouldn't rely on nostalgia. It would be wrapped in 6 inches of hardened steel armor, powered by nuclear reactors, and instead of massive cannons loaded with powder bags, it would carry vast banks of missile launch cells and high-energy railguns. Not a vessel meant to disappear from radar, but one designed to take hits and keep fighting. A ship built to stand in the middle of the storm. And that's where the friction begins. Because the Navy itself isn't asking for battleships. For more than 10 years, Pentagon planners have pushed a doctrine called distributed maritime operations. The thinking is brutally simple. and driven by numbers. Concentrate too much firepower into one enormous, costly platform, and you create a single point of failure. One fast, well-placed missile from China, and suddenly you've lost 2,000 lives and tens of billions of dollars in one strike. From that perspective, big ships look like liabilities. So the Navy is moving in the opposite direction. Their vision is a so-called mosquito fleet, small, scattered, and often unmanned. Drone vessels that cost a fraction of a destroyer. If one is destroyed, it's a statistic, not a national tragedy. That's why current shipbuilding plans pour money into frigates and unmanned platforms. They're harder to target and easier to replace. The president's idea turns that logic upside down. He argues that a mosquito fleet lacks presence. A drone boat doesn't intimidate. It doesn't loom off a hostile coastline or send a message just by existing. A battleship does. History offers a powerful example. When the USS Missouri entered the Persian Gulf in 1991, Iraqi soldiers surrendered to its unmanned aircraft. The thunder of a 16-inch shell ripping through the sky wasn't just firepower, it was psychological warfare. Fear made real. And that's the heart of the argument, that somewhere along the way, the U.S. Navy may have traded raw, undeniable intimidation for pure efficiency, and that choice could matter more than anyone wants to admit. We've become experts at building ships that function like floating missile launchers, efficient, lethal, and optimized on paper. But they don't inspire fear. And in global power politics, intimidation isn't optional. It's half the equation. So let's push this idea forward and see where it really leads. Imagine the paperwork is signed. The Golden Fleet program officially begins. What comes next isn't theory or nostalgia. It's the unforgiving reality of naval engineering. And the first obstacle is armor. A warship wrapped in 6 inches of solid steel is a weight problem on a massive scale. American shipyards haven't manufactured true battleship-grade armor belts since the end of World War II. The industrial base to produce that kind of hardened steel has mostly vanished. Before a single keel could be laid, the U.S. would have to rebuild the factories capable of making the armor itself. Then comes the power issue. A modern battleship wouldn't burn fuel oil. It would need nuclear reactors to generate the enormous amounts of electricity required for next-generation weapons. High-energy lasers to intercept incoming missiles. Railguns hurling projectiles at speeds approaching Mach 7. But placing nuclear reactors inside a ship that's expected to take enemy fire is a dangerous gamble. A direct hit near the reactor doesn't just mean losing a ship. It risks a catastrophic environmental and political nightmare. And then there's the problem that worries admirals the most: manpower. An Iowa-class battleship needed around 1,800 sailors to function. Today's Arleigh Burke destroyers operate with roughly 300. The ultramodern Zumwalt class needs fewer than 200. At the same time, the U.S. Navy is dealing with the worst recruiting shortfall in its history, struggling to crew the ships it already has. To operate even a small fleet of battleships, you'd need thousands of highly trained sailors, unless automation takes over most of the work. Could you design a battleship that runs with just 200 people? Possibly. But that comes at a cost. Because when a ship is hit, it's human hands that save it. Crews battling fires, sealing compartments, and keeping the ship alive. Remove that manpower, and you may lose the very resilience a battleship is supposed to bring. Put a massive warship out at sea with only a skeleton crew, and a single torpedo doesn't have to destroy it outright. Flooding alone can finish the job, simply because there aren't enough sailors on board to contain the damage. And that leads directly to the biggest variable in this entire debate: China. The Chinese Navy is expanding at a pace the United States hasn't matched since the Second World War. Shipyards are running non-stop, turning out vessels year after year. Among them are the Type 055s, enormous 13,000-ton warships that function more like cruisers than destroyers, and which many analysts consider the most powerful surface combatants afloat today. The president's argument is that the U.S. is losing a tonnage war, building fewer ships and lighter ones, while China produces bigger and heavier platforms at scale. But China's naval strategy isn't about matching ship for ship. It's about keeping American forces at arm's length. Along its coastline, China has built a dense wall of missiles specifically designed to hunt large, slow targets at sea. That's why critics say constructing a battleship in 2025 is like sending a medieval knight in full armor onto a modern battlefield. When a hypersonic missile is screaming in at Mach 10, 6 inches of steel may not matter at all. The impact alone can liquefy or fracture armor on contact. That reality is what pushed modern navies toward active defense, destroying incoming threats before they hit, instead of passive defense, which assumes the ship will absorb the blow and survive. But inside the White House, another argument is gaining momentum. The economics of missile defense are broken. Today, if an adversary launches a $20,000 drone at a U.S. destroyer, the response is often a $2 million interceptor missile. It's an unsustainable exchange, trading luxury cars to stop economy vehicles. Over time, that math works against us. A heavily armored battleship armed with conventional guns or railguns changes that equation. Artillery rounds cost almost nothing compared to missiles, and even a railgun shot comes in around $25,000, not millions. If such a ship can operate near the coast, absorb punishment, and return fire cheaply and relentlessly, it forces the enemy to burn through their most expensive weapons just to slow it down. And in doing so, it could protect what really matters, keeping fragile, irreplaceable assets like aircraft carriers safely out of reach, while the battleship takes the hits meant for them. So what does all of this point to? At its core, the Navy is facing a collision between two completely different worldviews. On one side is a technocrat vision, fleets built around stealth, networking, automation, and precision. Ships that are fast, smart, and lethal, but lightly built and vulnerable once they're hit. On the other side is a populist vision, huge, unmistakable warships that are armored, visible from the horizon, and designed to absorb punishment while projecting raw power. Not elegant, but intimidating. The Golden Fleet idea hints at a compromise between these extremes. Picture a vessel with the physical presence of a battleship, but instead of relying on cannons, it carries something like 500 missile launch cells, an arsenal ship that never needs to close in. It could sit hundreds of miles offshore and unleash overwhelming barrages, saturating enemy defenses simply through volume. With heavy steel protection to survive the missiles that slip through, and enough onboard power to run advanced laser defenses, it becomes both fortress and weapon, shield and sword combined. But making something like that isn't just an engineering challenge. It demands a level of national commitment the United States hasn't summoned in nearly a century. It also means acknowledging an uncomfortable possibility that decades of naval design, prioritizing light materials and efficiency over survivability may have gone too far, and the Pentagon is notoriously resistant to admitting it ever took a wrong turn. September 30th may have sounded like just another speech, but in the intelligence and defense world, words from a commander-in-chief aren't casual. They're signals. And right now, somewhere behind closed doors, design teams are almost certainly reopening old plans while engineers quietly run the numbers on what happens when you bolt 6 inches of steel onto a nuclear-powered warship. The arguments are spilling out of briefing rooms and into the officers' mess. Younger commanders push for drones, networks, and swarming systems. The veterans argue for something simpler and heavier, steel that doesn't soften, hulls that don't fail the moment they're hit. Because when you strip modern warfare down to its core, when sensors are jammed, satellites are knocked out, and missile magazines are empty, naval combat returns to a brutal constant. Two ships take damage. One stays afloat, one doesn't. And history shows that the ship with more protection usually makes it back. The president wants battleships to return to the fleet. The idea is controversial. The price tag would be enormous. The technical hurdles are staggering. But standing before those 800 senior officers, describing a warship that could push through fire instead of disintegrating, he struck something deep inside the military psyche, the desire to be untouchable, whether that instinct is a hard reality or just an echo from the wars of the 1940s is a question we may soon be forced to answer. So let me leave you with this. If a conflict breaks out with a peer power like China, where would you rather be? On a sleek, high-tech destroyer built from aluminum, depending on stealth to survive, or aboard a 50,000-ton steel giant designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting? Does armor still have a place in an era of hypersonic missiles? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every single one. And I'll see you in the next video.